I was at a tech meetup a few weeks ago, listening to this founder pitch his new Web3 startup. He was electric, just full of energy, pacing the stage and painting this incredible vision of a new internet. He kept hitting all the big words: decentralization, anti-fragile, censorship-resistant. He was describing a future that was free from the control of big tech, a system that couldn't be shut down by any single government or corporation. He was so passionate, you could tell he absolutely believed every word. The audience was hooked. But then, during the Q&A, someone asked a pretty simple technical question. Where are you actually hosting the nodes for this? The founder didn't even blink. He just smiled like it was the most obvious thing in the world and said, "Oh, we just spun up a bunch of instances on AWS. It's just easier, faster, and way more reliable for scaling." He said it so casually, so practically, and in that one moment, the entire grand revolutionary vision he'd just spent 20 minutes building, it evaporated. The guy promising to build a rebellion against the empire was proudly renting his headquarters from the emperor's main castle. The sheer gap between the grand ideal and the practical reality, the fact that his uncensorable new world could be turned off with one phone call to Amazon's legal team, was staggering. And what was even more staggering was that he didn't seem to see the contradiction at all.
And that, right there, is the core tension we are diving into today. That story, it perfectly captures the massive, massive gap between the vision of Web3 and the reality. The whole revolutionary promise rests on escaping big tech's infrastructure. It's about true decentralization, being anti-fragile, resisting censorship. But the practical reality, as that founder just laid bare, is this systemic dependency on the very centralized giants it wants to replace.
It's like a rebellion built with the king's own concrete.
Rented by the hour, exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to get past the ideology and just look at the cold, hard facts. We need to quantify this dependency with real network data, look at the huge geopolitical risks this creates, and break down the engineering and financial traps that make this centralized path so irresistible for builders.
And finally, look at the security vulnerabilities that pop up when the decentralized future runs on the centralized past. Okay, so let's unpack this with the data we've gathered. The ideal is supposed to be these truly distributed nodes, right? Servers running everywhere, in basements, small data centers, across hundreds of countries. But what does the hard evidence actually show about where Web3 lives? Is this just a small compromise, or is it, a system-wide structural flaw?
Oh, it's far beyond a minor compromise. The evidence points to a deep structural flaw that affects the biggest and most important networks out there. We can say pretty definitively that a huge majority of the nodes that run these supposedly decentralized networks, they're housed in centralized data centers.
Okay.
And this isn't just about convenience, it's about critical concentration, which creates these single points of failure.
So let's get specific. What about Ethereum? Post-merge, it's the backbone for so much of DeFi, of the whole dApp ecosystem. If Ethereum nodes are distributed, the network should be safe, right?
Well, that distribution is largely an illusion, at least at the infrastructure level. Recent studies show that 65% of all Ethereum nodes are housed in centralized data centers.
65%, so nearly 2/3.
Yep. That number alone should really stop any true decentralist in their tracks. But here's the most alarming part. 2/3 of those centralized nodes, so 69% of them, come from just 3 major cloud providers.
3 companies. So you're saying something like 45% of the entire Ethereum network is hosted by just 3 companies.
That's right. It's staggering when you think about the core ethos of this technology.
And I'm guessing one of those 3 is a lot bigger than the others.
And that guess shifts this from staggering to, frankly, terrifying. Amazon Web Services, AWS, hosts more than 50% of the nodes on the Ethereum mainnet.
Over half.
Over half. So think about that for a second. One subsidiary of one corporation potentially holds a veto over half of the network that was built to oppose corporate control. If AWS has a major outage, or if they're forced to shut down certain services, the impact on Ethereum would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
And immediate.
And AWS isn't the only one. Who are the other key players here that are sharing this centralized load?
AWS is definitely the heavyweight, but the others contribute to the risk in a big way. The other key provider is Hetzner. It's a major European provider based in Germany, and it hosts over 15% of Ethereum nodes.
15%.
Then you have OVH, Oracle, Alibaba, and Google. Each of them hosts somewhere between, say, 3.5 to 4.1%. And what's important here isn't just the numbers, but the type of company. They're all hyperscalers.
Right.
They offer incredible reliability and scale, but they also bring compliance rules, centralized control, and terms of service that are just fundamentally at odds with the goals of Web3.
I want to stick on Hetzner for a second. You said they're a German company, a European company. They have about 15% of Ethereum's nodes. How is that different from, say, US-based AWS or Google? Does that jurisdiction matter?
It's a crucial distinction, especially when we start talking about geopolitical risk. So AWS is subject strictly to U.S. jurisdiction. That means things like OFAC sanctions are the primary threat.
Right.
Hetzner, on the other hand, is primarily subject to German and, more broadly, EU data regulations and political pressures. So if the U.S. government targets the network through AWS, the other half of the network can keep running, even if it's badly hampered. But if the EU were to decide that, say, certain validator activities violate GDPR or some new EU financial regulation, Hetzner would be forced to comply.
And that could wipe out another 15% of the network's infrastructure.
Exactly. So the centralization isn't just about a single company, it's about jurisdictional concentration, too.
And this isn't just an Ethereum problem, right? When we look at Solana, which is a major competitor known for its high speed, the situation there is even worse.
It is. It's a parallel scenario, and you could argue it's worse. The concentration risk is just as bad for Solana. Estimates suggest that a staggering 95% of Solana nodes are in data centers.
95. So only 5% are actually truly independent.
That's the estimate. And out of that 95%, 72% are hosted by the same big cloud providers that Ethereum uses. Now, with Solana, AWS has a smaller piece of the pie, about 3%. The load is heavily carried by Hetzner.
The German provider.
Right. Hetzner hosts an astonishing 42% of all Solana nodes. OVH is next with 26%.
Hold on. 42% of a major blockchain relies on a single German hosting company. That puts a massive potential chokehold on Solana that's subject to European jurisdiction, totally separate from the U.S. regulatory issues we were just talking about with Ethereum.
Absolutely. The reliance on Hetzner for Solana is a key vulnerability. If the German government were to mandate some specific operational change or a new compliance rule for these nodes, nearly half of the Solana network would be instantly affected. It just confirms that it doesn't matter what the blockchain protocol is, proof of work, proof of stake, whatever. The underlying infrastructure trend is to rely on these centralized, non-distributed data centers. And that's a systemic weakness.
So we've got centralized providers hosting the nodes, but then there's this second layer of concentration risk, which is geography. Even if the nodes were spread across 50 different data centers, if all 50 are in the same country, the political risk is still there.
That is the critical point. The problem is compounded by this geographical clustering. When you look at where these so-called distributed Ethereum nodes are physically located in the world, nearly 60% of them are in just 2 countries.
Just 2?
Just 2. The United States accounts for about 46.4% of all nodes, and Germany accounts for another 13.4%.
Wait, let me get this straight. Nearly 2/3 of the entire global network is physically located in just 2 nations. That just destroys the whole narrative of a global, borderless financial system.
Precisely. It introduces a profound geopolitical vulnerability. It means that a significant government intervention, a court order, a new regulation coming out of Washington, D.C. or Berlin could unilaterally impact the entire network's decentralization and integrity at the infrastructure level. So the system's resilience isn't really tied to its protocol. It's tied to the legal goodwill and geopolitical stability of 2 national governments. And if the U.S. decides to act, they can leverage both their physical control over nodes inside the U.S. and their corporate control over AWS globally. It's a double whammy.
And that structural data leads us right to the big so what question. If the physical infrastructure is centralized and clustered, how does that compromise the core promise of Web3, the promise of censorship resistance? This is where the ideology smacks right into regulatory reality. We really need to look at how U.S. government pressure on a company like AWS could just unilaterally break these supposedly decentralized networks.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road. And the primary mechanism for this pressure is U.S. regulatory frameworks, especially sanctions. The big one is OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. This creates a severe and pretty unique legal risk for any U.S.-based hosting provider.
So walk us through that legal bind. Why is it such a massive problem for Amazon if one of its AWS-hosted nodes processes a sanctioned transaction?
It all comes down to legal culpability under U.S. law. If a node hosted on AWS processes a transaction from a sanctioned address, let's say an address linked to a protocol like Tornado Cash, which was sanctioned for money laundering, Amazon could potentially be accused of assisting in the evasion of U.S. sanctions.
No.
This puts AWS in a near impossible position.
But I hear the argument all the time that a node is just running open source code. It's passive. Why is AWS considered so uniquely vulnerable compared to, say, an individual running a validator from their basement?
That is the critical distinction that so often gets lost in this debate. An individual validator or a mining pool operator, they're running the application layer. They can actually choose which transactions to include or exclude from the blocks they create.
So they can comply with sanctions themselves.
Exactly. They have discretion. They can participate in censorship if they have to, but AWS is just providing the raw infrastructure, the virtual machine, the electricity, the network connection. They're an infrastructure as a service provider, or IS. The problem is AWS can't selectively exclude specific transactions that are being processed by the nodes it hosts. But they can't just look inside the encrypted traffic and say, oh, stop, that one's from a sanctioned address.
Right, they just see an Ethereum node running.
They just see an instance running on their hardware. And yet, if that node contributes to sanctions evasion, AWS is legally complicit for providing the platform.
So they're caught in this really deep regulatory bind. They can't inspect the data without violating privacy and breaking their own model, but they're still legally on the hook for what happens on their servers because of U.S. jurisdiction. So what's the logical corporate risk-averse response to that kind of ambiguity?
The only viable risk-averse response for a publicly traded U.S. company under strict compliance laws is to just remove the liability entirely. To fully adhere to U.S. sanctions, especially if they were interpreted broadly, AWS might have no option but to shut down all Ethereum nodes running on its servers.
Not just the one node, but all of them.
All of them, either within U.S. jurisdiction or potentially globally if the sanction is sweeping enough to apply to all U.S. corporate assets worldwide. And this isn't some theoretical threat, it's a legal compulsion.
Yeah.
Any U.S. company, AWS, Google Cloud, DigitalOcean, they'd all be forced to comply. The fact that nearly half the network is in the U.S., on U.S. platforms, makes this a profound system-wide vulnerability. It just undermines the entire premise of censorship resistance.
And we have a powerful and sadly a true story that just illustrates this perfectly. It takes the discussion beyond DeFi and into human rights, into political resistance. It shows what happens when your infrastructure touches the centralized cloud. It inherits the weakest link of that cloud's home country.
We're talking about the story of Miguel, a journalist in Caracas. Miguel was using a decentralized publishing platform, a Web3 blog, the kind that promises your content is immutable and free from control to document local corruption. He had total faith in its censorship-proof nature because it was on the blockchain, secured by crypto. He wasn't using Twitter or a local server. He was using the new internet. And then one morning, his site was just inaccessible, not slow, gone.
And he didn't get a takedown notice from his own government in Venezuela, which is what you'd expect.
No, and the irony here is just crushing. The platform's data availability layer, the part that actually stores the content so people can view it, was running almost entirely on AWS S3 buckets, hosted in the US.
So the platform was decentralized in its token, but completely centralized in its storage.
Completely. And when a new broad US sanctions update came out, the cloud provider simply suspended the account to ensure they were compliant, citing some vague violation of their terms of service.
Wait, so the man fighting censorship from his own government was ultimately silenced by a corporate compliance officer sitting in an office in Virginia. The level of irony is it's brutal.
It highlights a crucial distinction that we often overlook in engineering. We talk about protocol decentralization, how blocks get validated, but we ignore the infrastructure layers that make the protocol actually usable, the storage, the front-end hosting, the API access. Miguel's platform was silenced, not because the Ethereum blockchain was censored, but because the centralized infrastructure needed to retrieve and show his content was taken down by a compliance decision.
A decision driven by U.S. law.
Exactly. So if a single corporate policy update triggered by government pressure on one company can shut down a global censorship-resistant network, is that technology really doing what it claims to do? It just proves that the weakest link in the chain is what defines the system's overall strength.
And the purists, the people who are rightly horrified by Miguel's story, they demand truly decentralized physical infrastructure. But the pragmatists, the builders, they're all on AWS because, like that founder said, it's easier, faster, and more reliable. So we have to explore the engineering complexities that make the cloud so appealing and why building a genuine distributed alternative is so incredibly hard.
The short answer is that builders, especially startups, they need reliability, they need scalability, and they need predictable costs to survive. And to understand why, you have to look at the immense difficulty of building the alternative, a genuinely decentralized physical infrastructure that can compete with literally trillions of dollars of centralized investment over decades.
The story of Alara's team trying to build a genuinely decentralized storage network is a perfect illustration of this engineering nightmare. They tried to do it the right way from the ground up, didn't they?
They did, and their struggle is basically the archetype for why centralization is winning this infrastructure battle. So you have this small, dedicated team of engineers with Alara as their leader. They refuse to use Google Cloud or AWS. They are trying to build a storage network on their own physical servers and on nodes run by users scattered across different continents. For the first 6 months, every single day is a new disaster. The network is agonizingly slow because of the high latency between all these dispersed nodes. They're facing constant low-level failures. A critical software update accidentally wiped out the data on 3 of their biggest physical nodes because the hardware setups aren't consistent. Their operational costs are astronomical. The electricity bill alone, just for cooling and powering the raw servers, rivals their entire payroll.
So they're spending all their time just keeping the lights on.
80% of their time is spent on hardware debugging, physical security, and navigating legal compliance in different countries instead of actually focusing on their product.
And when they finally do get some success, the scalability problem just delivers the final crushing blow.
That's the moment of truth for any of these projects. A popular blog links to their project, and it drives this sudden, massive spike in traffic, a kind of DDoS of success, and the network just collapses. 40% of it crashes instantly because the user-run nodes and their limited bare metal servers just can't handle that burst of capacity. They don't have the elasticity of the cloud.
Right.
AWS, on the other hand, can scale from 10 instances to 10,000 in minutes across multiple availability zones. That's what decades of investment and billions of dollars buys you.
So the conclusion, really, is that AWS and Google have created a virtually unbeatable product, not through some nefarious plan, but just by investing the time and capital to make something that reliably scales and, well, it just works.
Exactly. Building a physical distributed alternative that can offer you comparable uptime, latency, and security without sacrificing performance is just immensely complex, it's costly, and it's extremely difficult to scale. The cloud offers predictability. The decentralized option right now offers chaos and a huge maintenance burden.
So let's just summarize the big structural advantages of these hyperscalers that make them so appealing to builders. Beyond just being reliable, it's about their entire service catalog, isn't it?
It is. They offer 3 main advantages that are just so hard to replicate. First, they provide core services across all 3 major models. You've got IS, infrastructure as a service. That's the raw compute, storage, and networking. For Web3, this is spinning up virtual machines for nodes or using massive storage buckets. Then there's PaaS, platform as a service. This gives you specialized environments like Microsoft Azure's blockchain workbench or Amazon managed blockchain where you can deploy your own blockchain without managing the hardware. And finally, SaaS, software as a service. These are the turnkey development tools and monitoring solutions that simplify the whole process. The second advantage is cost control, specifically the upfront cost. The initial cost to deploy on a hyperscaler is almost zero. They even give you startup credits.
Right, they get you hooked early.
Exactly. Moving away from them means you suddenly have to pay for all the setup, maintenance, security, and hardware yourself, which immediately slows you down.
And that brings us to one of the biggest complaints from people who do try to scale on these platforms. The opaque pricing, especially those notorious data egress fees. Can you explain what those are and why they're such a budget killer for decentralized projects?
This is a massive source of frustration and waste, and it's a very deliberate design choice by the cloud providers. Data egress fees are the charges you get when you move data out of a centralized cloud provider's network, whether it's to a user's device, another cloud, or a decentralized storage solution. In a Web2 model, where your data mostly stays within one vendor's ecosystem, the fees are manageable. But in a decentralized model, the whole point is data mobility, peer-to-peer sharing, using multiple platforms.
So every time a user downloads something,
or the application moves data to a different provider for processing, these egress fees stack up astronomically. They can often make up 50% or more of your total cloud bill.
wow.
It's basically vendor lock-in disguised as a transfer fee. It leads to huge budget overruns. Studies show up to 35% of cloud spending is just wasted on underutilized resources or these hidden charges.
That sounds like a perfect opportunity for a decentralized solution to gain some traction by offering transparent, flat rates, and getting rid of that punitive model.
Absolutely. And this crisis has spurred a lot of innovation aimed at fixing those broken economics. We are starting to see decentralized virtual server models like the Fluence model, which specifically target this opacity. Fluence aims to offer transparent, flat-rate pricing, and they claim they can cut infrastructure costs by up to 75% compared to the big guys, precisely because they get rid of hitting charges like egress fees.
How do they manage that kind of cost efficiency while still maintaining performance?
Well, they leverage a global distributed network of underutilized compute resources. So instead of building new, expensive data centers, they tap into capacity that's already available from independent operators or smaller data centers around the world. This enhances elasticity so the network can grow or shrink with demand, and it avoids that vendor lock-in that defines the hyperscaler economy. It's a fundamental shift. It's saying decentralization isn't just about ideology anymore. It's about cost efficiency and fighting back against these punitive pricing models.
So true decentralization might not look like Alara's doomed experiment with Raspberry Pis in a basement. It might look more like a sophisticated hybrid system that uses centralized stability where it's needed, but then modularizes the rest.
That is the emerging consensus, yeah. Among high-level node operators and researchers, teams are moving toward these hybrid architectures, a mix of hyperscalers, edge networks, and bare metal servers to improve their fault tolerance. It's a modular shift, so you use specialized decentralized solutions like Filecoin or Arweave for your permanent storage, but you still leverage cloud elasticity for high-demand computation. The goal is to just disperse the risk geographically and functionally. So if one region or one service gets shut down, traffic can be rerouted automatically. It's an admission that we can't really live without the cloud's convenience, but we have to mitigate its control.
And that decision to use AWS, it's not purely about engineering. It's deeply rooted in money, in venture capital strategy, and this overwhelming pressure to just grow fast. We need to analyze the economic incentives, the VC strategies that keep Web3 reliant on centralized clouds. This is the financial side of that original sin.
The flow of capital is maybe the single greatest driver of centralization in Web3. Capital chases returns, and returns are maximized by speed and stability, not by slow, expensive ideological purity. And we have a perfect illustration of how this economic trap works in the story of the Lagos founder.
Tell us about this founder in Lagos. He was trying to get funding for a decentralized streaming service. This really highlights that clash between revolutionary ideals and investment reality.
It's an archetype, unfortunately. This young founder in Lagos, he has this brilliant utopian idea for a Web3 streaming service. Truly peer-to-peer, cutting out every middleman, decentralized down to the last byte. And he successfully pitches the vision to a major U.S. venture capital fund. The VCs, they love the disruption aspect, but then the pragmatic questions start. How are you going to onboard your first 1 million users in 6 months? How do you guarantee 4K streaming with zero buffering globally? How do you manage a massive spike in scale overnight?
And the founder tries to explain his robust, resilient, distributed architecture, only to be immediately shut down by the people with the money.
Exactly. The VC partner who's heard this pitch 100 times just cuts him off. The advice is ruthless pragmatism. Look, decentralization is great for the white paper. It's great for the token sale. But for launching, use AWS for video hosting and transcoding. Use a centralized Postgres database for user accounts. We need you to move fast and break things, not reinvent the wheel of global content delivery.
And then decentralize later.
You can decentralize the payment token, the governance, the IP ledger later.
That is the venture capital imperative in a nutshell. Capital follows growth and returns, not pure ideology. And the fastest path to market, the fastest way to get that critical funding is through centralized, proven infrastructure.
And it creates this self-perpetuating economic trap. The money that's funding the revolution demands speed and performance that only the hyperscalers can deliver right now. So this forces Web3 builders to just rebuild the old monopolistic world, but with a new token layer slapped on top. The result is this concentration of economic control where the core assets, the user data, the video streams, the speed, they all remain reliant on a centralized choke point.
That sounds dangerously familiar. It sounds like the early days of Web 2, where companies like Facebook and Uber prioritized growth and scale above everything else, and then later had to face massive ethical and regulatory blowback for that centralization.
That comparison is spot on. The Web3 VCs learned the lesson of Web 2, which was scale first, worry about the philosophy later. But in Web3, the philosophical integrity is the value proposition.
By prioritizing speed and using centralized platforms, they are essentially financing the destruction of the very ideology that makes Web3 unique. And that leads, inevitably, to what some are calling decentralized monopolies.
And beyond just influencing how startups are built, these centralized cloud providers aren't just passive. They're actively extracting significant value from this decentralized ecosystem. How are they monetizing this whole contradictory arrangement? They have highly diversified, very sophisticated revenue streams here. They're monetizing at every layer of the tech stack. There's the II, charging for the raw compute and storage for that 65% of Ethereum nodes and 95% of Solana nodes they host. There's PaaS, where they provide managed services like Amazon Managed Blockchain, and they charge subscription and usage fees for that. And then SaaS, delivering the turnkey applications, the developer toolkits, the monitoring dashboards that Web3 teams use to manage their deployments. And on top of all that, they get revenue from database access fees, data transfer fees, those egress fees again, and network usage, especially for high bandwidth apps like NFT marketplaces.
And the total financial shift here is enormous. The savings that blockchain tech is generating in some sectors are being redirected straight into the pockets of these same cloud providers.
That's a crucial insight into this huge monetary shift in corporate IT spending. Studies suggest that integrating blockchain could reduce infrastructure costs for the traditional financial sector, so banking, insurance, asset management, by $15 to $20 billion a year. That's money that used to be spent on expensive legacy IT systems, internal data centers, archaic software licenses.
So instead of that money just dissolving or being redistributed in a decentralized way, where is it going now?
It's being redirected almost entirely toward modern cloud hosting services. These centralized platforms are the only ones currently equipped to handle the massive computational and storage demands of blockchain integration, smart contract testing, high-frequency settlement systems. So the cost saving created by decentralized tech flows straight to the biggest centralized tech companies, which solidifies their position as the infrastructure monopolists for the next generation of finance.
Creating those decentralized monopolies you mentioned.
Exactly, where centralized entities exert massive influence and concentrate economic control, even if the underlying ledger is decentralized.
Okay, so this dependency isn't just an ideological problem or an economic one. It creates serious, measurable risk. Let's look at what happens when the centralization inevitably breaks or gets exploited, exposing the network's fragility. We're moving from the abstract to concrete security vulnerabilities that cost people real money.
And we've seen multiple clear examples of this. The deep reliance on centralized cloud systems creates single points of failure that trigger systemic global digital crises. The irony is just staggering. A sector built on the idea of anti-fragility and redundancy is critically hobbled by a simple failure in a centralized structure.
The major cloud outages, like that big AWS failure a few years ago, that has to be the definitive case study here. How far-reaching was the failure in the crypto space when that centralized infrastructure went down?
That large-scale failure at AWS triggered a widespread crisis, and the crypto space was hit hard. Major exchanges like Coinbase saw their users instantly lose the ability to log in, place trades, or withdraw funds. Prominent NFT marketplaces were paralyzed. Transactions were halted, access to digital assets was blocked, including high-value assets like Bored Apes. And the irony is the decentralized assets were totally safe on the blockchain, but the centralized access point, the front-end app, the exchange infrastructure, the API connection, that was all hosted on the compromised AWS servers.
So the network is only as decentralized as its most centralized access layer.
Precisely. The event sparked widespread criticism because it highlighted that fact so vividly.
So a single cloud failure, which happens all the time, can essentially paralyze a supposedly anti-fragile global financial system. But beyond just simple outages, this dependency creates a massive and often invisible attack surface for sophisticated hackers.
That's the next level of vulnerability, and it's deeply rooted in the practical architecture of dApps. To get performance and keep costs down, practical dApps rely heavily on centralized intermediaries, or CIs, for everything. Accessing the blockchain via services like Infura, hosting marketplace front-ends, managing off-chain metadata. And this reliance introduces architecture-level vulnerabilities that can be exploited by what we call off-chain network adversaries.
So you're saying that even if the smart contract code on the blockchain itself is perfect, totally secure, a user can still have their assets hijacked because of a weakness in the centralized part that provides the front-end experience.
Precisely. That is the definition of off-chain security risk. Almost every single interaction a user has with a centralized entity, The marketplace servers, the API gateways, the third-party JavaScript libraries can be exploited to hijack NFTs or crypto from the user. These attacks are usually launched through really sophisticated network attacks like BGP or DNS hijacking, which lets the attacker intercept or reroute communication before it even gets encrypted or hits the smart contract.
Let's unpack that jargon a bit. For our listeners, what is DNS hijacking, and how does it let an attacker get into that man-in-the-middle position against a DApp?
Okay, so DNS, the domain name system, is basically the phone book of the internet. It translates a website name, like OpenSea.io, into an IP address. If an attacker hijacks the DNS entry for a marketplace, they can redirect a user to their own malicious server that looks identical to the real site. Once they've intercepted that communication, even if the connection is encrypted with TLS, they become the man in the middle. And they can then modify the crucial data that the centralized marketplace server is supplying to the user's wallet before the user signs the transaction.
Okay, so walk us through the specific methods attackers use to exploit this, maybe focusing on NFT marketplaces as a clear, high-value target.
There are three primary families of attack that leverage this dependency. The first is modifying transaction parameters to fleece the seller. So a seller logs into a marketplace to list their NFT for, say, 10 ETH. The attacker, sitting in the hijack connection, intercepts that request and changes the selling price from 10 ETH down to 0.001 ETH, and then forwards that modified transaction to the user's wallet, like MetaMask, for a signature.
And the seller just sees a normal signature request.
Right. They sign for the low price without realizing it, and the attacker instantly buys the NFT for virtually nothing. The seller's tricked into signing something that was corrupted off-chain.
That's a brutal exploitation of trust in the front end. What about for buyers? How are they targeted?
The second attack targets the buyer. The buyer is looking at a legitimate, high-value NFT, maybe a rare CryptoPunk. The attacker hijacks the connection and modifies the asset identifier that the marketplace server is supplying to the wallet for purchase confirmation. So the buyer thinks they're buying CryptoPunk number 420, but the attacker tricks them into buying a different, worthless attacker-owned asset by just changing the ID in the request.
And the buyer pays the full price.
They paid the full price for the legitimate asset, but the funds go to the wrong contract, and they get this cheap, worthless NFT owned by the attacker.
And the third, and I'm guessing most severe attack, involves redirecting the money itself.
This is just straight-up theft of funds. Attackers can modify the transaction destination address. So instead of the buyer being prompted to send their transaction to the legitimate NFT marketplace smart contract, the attacker redirects it to a malicious smart contract they control. This malicious contract just steals the ETH attached to the transaction. And even when the user gets a notification from MetaMask, it might still show that the transaction originated from a legitimate source, making it extremely hard to detect unless you're carefully auditing the smart contract address itself.
Which most users just don't do.
Nobody does that.
And this isn't just a theoretical vulnerability that engineers worry about on a whiteboard. This is a measurable problem in the market today.
The measurement results are deeply concerning. They underscore the immediate risk. Studies have shown that many large NFT marketplaces are susceptible to these specific hijacking attacks. One measurement found that 6 out of the 10 largest marketplaces were vulnerable to one or more of these attack methods. And this vulnerability often comes from relying too heavily on these centralized intermediaries for essential services, or including vulnerable JavaScript from third-party providers. This concentration of off-chain dependency creates an extremely large and already exploited attack surface that just fundamentally undermines the security premise of the whole system. The most secure smart contract in the world can't protect you if you sign a transaction that's already been corrupted by a centralized server. The Web3 ecosystem is navigating a complex and profoundly challenging dichotomy. On one hand, blockchain technology has the potential to dramatically reduce infrastructure costs, remove rent-seeking middlemen, and genuinely distribute value creation to individuals. But the current overwhelming dependency on centralized infrastructure, namely the big three cloud providers, introduces these profound geopolitical, economic, and security risks that fundamentally compromise its core ideals. We are witnessing efficiency being achieved at the direct expense of true resilience and censorship resistance. The centralization of hosting, both geographically and structurally, just renders the entire system vulnerable to sanctions, to single points of failure, and to these sophisticated off-chain attacks that undermine the very trust that the blockchain itself is supposed to establish.
So the success of Web3, it really depends on finding a sustainable and scalable balance between the efficiency that the hyperscalers provide and the requirement for true resilience. The evolution seems to be pointing toward complex hybrid systems, architectures that leverage the stability and scale of centralized services. Because building a genuinely robust, distributed physical alternative is just so immensely difficult and costly. But at the same time, cultivating the growth of these modular, decentralized alternatives like Fluence and strengthening fault tolerance through multi-provider deployment. The core tension remains the defining challenge for this generation of technology. The people funding and building this decentralized revolution are doing so using the master's tools. And unless that dependency is broken, those tools will forever dictate the limits of the revolution itself.